So what are the things that control photosynthesis? We need to look at sunlight availability, carbon dioxide levels, your water availability, temperature ranges, ventilation, humidity, and lighting. And some people describe insulation, but that's actually just something that's going to help us with temperature, right? So I like to say that, well, that's a subsection of temperature. So photosynthesis of plants is not very efficient. They're not actually great at doing this. So of the sunlight that reaches the surface of a leaf, approximately 75% of it is evaporated off. It doesn't use it. 15% then gets reflected. 5% transmits through the leaf, and 4% gets transmitted into heat energy, and 1% is for photosynthesis. Not very good. Anybody know how much our photosynthetic panels, like a solar panel, can do currently? Like 9. So 9 versus 1. So they're quite efficient. So this is something we need to look at. If we can work on that 1%, we can increase that, right? Which we can. Then we can get more growth. So that's how they do that. So how do they do that? Well, we can look at sunlight availability. So in the temperate areas of the world, your sun angle is very low in comparison to here. Mine might be at 85, and if you were in Canada, it might be as low as 40. So at this point, we can have roofs and shades can be installed that automatically retract. So if I'm here in a temperate climate, it's too much, so I can put up shade cloths. So at noon, or maybe at 11. At 11, it starts getting really hot. The shade cloth will come out and protect my plants. And at 2 o'clock, right, I'll retract it so I can control the sunlight availability. And same thing, if I'm in a temperate climate, you need to make sure that your polytunnel is in line with your sun angle. For every degree that it's not perfectly in line, so it's not perpendicular, same issue with the Earth. Remember what happened when it didn't hit perpendicular? It reflects. So you need to make sure that you're orientated exactly 90 degrees. If it's not, you'll actually reflect the sunlight and you'll lower the temperatures in your polytunnel. So here we can use photosensing cells. So technology starts to help. Very simple. This probably only costs about $10, and it can sense the sunlight and then say, wow, this percentage of sunlight, open the shades or close the shades, for instance. And in here, shading can be done manually. So these are just some do-it-yourself ways. So a person has, the roller blinds. They just put them on top of their greenhouse, and if they pull the rope, they go down, and if they pull it, it rolls them back up. So they're using simple rolling blinds, or what they call louvers or Venetian blinds. So I can crank it, and they close, or I open it and open. So very simple. So these shading devices can reduce the heat and the light intensity, and any external blinds and louvers could provide shade. So if we look at that, reducing light transmission will result in reduced growth in your plants. So it's important to ensure that cladding is cleaned annually. So another problem that you can have, I put up my glass house and it gets dust and pollen, soot, things like that from cars. And if you don't clean it, you'll reduce the light transmission. So that's very important in a temperate climate to clean the greenhouse. Same thing on a polytunnel. How do you clean your polytunnel to get up there? Right? So that's going to make a big difference for you. So think about that. And so next we say, assume we have our greenhouse or polytunnel, whichever we like, and it's clean. We're getting our maximum light transmission. It's perpendicular to the sun for our sun angle, no obstructions. Inside of your greenhouse, it's closed, so you can measure the carbon dioxide levels inside of your greenhouse. So higher the ambient CO2 levels, will increase plant growth. So plants like increased CO2. So the higher the CO2 gets, the faster the plant grows. So this is showing you currently, I think we're at 250 parts per million, correct? In the world going up, right? Very steep space. But if you do 400 parts per million, so you put in a CO2 generator. So they actually generate CO2 inside of the greenhouses. So almost all commercial greenhouses around the world, this is what they do. So it's kind of weird to believe we have global warming driven by CO2. And we go to our food, where our food is grown, right? And what are they doing? They have a big CO2 generator pumping CO2 into the greenhouse. And if they can get it up to 850 parts per million, wow, they get a 450% growth rate increase. So how did they do that? Well, there we can see one inside of a greenhouse. And what they basically do is they bring in air, they burn some type of, typically, let's say gas, natural gas. And when they're burning the natural gas, but not putting in the heat, typically, they may actually also use the heat depending on the climate. Then they just have the CO2 stay in the greenhouse, at which time the levels go up. So it's very simple, natural gas burners, and you'll increase the CO2 within your greenhouse. But in a permaculture situation, other things make CO2. We breathe CO2, is that right? Animals also exhale CO2. So we can have a higher ambient CO2 levels without burning fossil fuels, right? So that's them burning fossil fuels is very convenient and easy. So some people will put chickens. So they put their chickens inside of their greenhouse. So here we can see a greenhouse attached to the chicken house, and between the greenhouse is a screen. So the chickens are in the glass house, but there's a screen between them and the greenhouse, so quite easy. And when I'm working in my greenhouse and I have any cuttings or anything that I'm doing, what can I do with those? I can feed my chickens. So it's very convenient to have the chickens near your greenhouse. So these animal shelters attached to greenhouse, this can work with anything from guinea pigs to little pigs to chickens to rabbits to any small animal that you might want to use. So here's another one. CO2s could be increased by just using animal manures. So in this particular greenhouse, which is a great community, permaculture community called, wow, ecology, but I'll come to me in a second. But in this particular greenhouse, they have added the manures underneath the growing beds. And so just the composting of the animal manure, this one when they were using horse manure, creates CO2, also methane. And that increases the CO2 levels, thus increasing the temperature or growing temperature and, because of the composting, and growing conditions within this greenhouse. So after we've done that, we start to either use animals or manures to work on CO2. That will give you up to a 450% increase in plant growth. We can start to work on watering conditions. So now inside of our greenhouse, we can control water very well. So watering can be controlled at the root level with drip irrigation or hydroponics. So lots of times we start to look into our greenhouse as a way to automate the watering. So when I go to work, my plants can still be watered. A timer can come on, and my plant's watered at noon because I want to grow lettuce and it needs water constantly, right? And I don't want it to become bitter. So I can automate that watering process. So here we can see hydroponics or permaponics, any type of system that you would like. So water availability can be given through sprinkler systems. They're very effective in a greenhouse. And depending on the area to cover and the volume of water that you need, you can investigate different types of sprinklers that give different patterns. So for this particular plant, I have this pattern. For this particular plant, I have another pattern. Most of these systems can be automated. You can buy timers today. Every year they're getting easier and cheaper. So as simple as plug it in, digital control, and hook it to my hose, and it will run my watering system. So very easy. Lots of these have, this is a hydrometer, so you can stick a sensor in. So if there's water in the soil, it doesn't water. But if the water goes below a certain level, it turns on the sprinkler. So it only turns them on if the plant needs water. So these are quite interesting. So after we do that, the relative humidity. So now that I have watered soil, for instance, I'm going to create humidity within inside. And humidity has a range that is good for plant growth. So humidity is a measure of how much water vapor is basically in the air. Humidity affects transpiration in the plants, which the plant's means of cooling down. So if you have too much humidity, and that happens to here a lot in the tropics, it gets so humid and it's hot. The plants actually can shut down their photosynthesis. They stop doing photosynthesis, thus no plant growth. So the relative comfort range for plant growth or idealized plant growth is somewhere probably in the 40-50% range. I need 40 to 50% humidity. If it starts going over that, it's too wet. And then they're not able to sweat, for instance, and they can't cool their bodies. So it's too hot, I can't sweat, and I start to get hot. So if the humidity is too high, the transportation slows down, and this will cause overheating. If the humidity is too low, though, this will speed up the plants and the transpiration, right? And they require more water. So if you can get your humidity correct, and that's why you'll see a lot of greenhouses you go in and there's humidity gauges, so that they can get, and they use less water. So they want to have an idealized humidity so that the plants maintain their correct temperature, and that will maximize your photosynthesis. Another technique that people will use, so if you're in a climate and you don't have enough humidity, for instance, it's the dry season, something like that here, then if we just water the concrete, which people describe as damping down, they pour water all over the floor, this evaporation will create humidity. So I water my plants at the optimal level, and then I water the floor to raise the humidity level within, called damping down. So a practice of just splashing water on the greenhouse floor will evaporate to raise the levels of your humidity. You could even put in a humidifier, so if you wanted to buy a machine, but these are just simple ways, not having to buy machines. So the temperature ranges in your glass houses can be ventilated by various means, and this will control the temperature throughout. So once you have a glass house, different than a polytunnel, sometimes polytunnels are difficult to control. It's just a big piece of plastic, so it gets too hot, right? But in a glass house, they have ways to open the windows so I can let out the heat, and that also aids with ventilation, is also another thing that we need to be concerned with. And that's why professional growers will lean towards investing in the glass house, because they have more control. But depending on what you're doing, that might not be worth it in the beginning. A polytunnel might be well worth the money, and if you get better at what you're doing, then you could invest in the say more expensive glass houses. So if we look at heating, so now we have an issue that even though we have our polytunnel in the daytime, it's warm, but at night it can get too cold, right? Our glass house is too cold. So how can we heat our glass house? So methods of heating could include using electricity, oil, gas, or wood. Permaculturists can use, for instance, wood, but we tend to not look towards those other means. So you could use compost or animals again. And so the ideal temperature for plant growth through photosynthesis is 25 to 35 degrees Celsius. So we try to maintain that it will not get lower than 25, but not warmer than 35. And so you can play with ventilation and heating. So how would you do that? Well, you can use various fuel sources. Here's a rocket stove, for instance. So they just use an oil drum there, make a fire, and you could regulate it. If you were using electricity, you can use something as simple as an electric radiator. Very inexpensive. You can buy these for $100. You plug it in, set the thermostat, and it'll help to maintain the temperature within your greenhouse. You could use piles of compost. So here we can see a polytunnel, and in the back of the greenhouse, they've made their compost pile. So they're composting. The compost pile can get up to 70 degrees Celsius, and that can help to maintain that. Or this other more technologically advanced one, they have the big compost pile outside the greenhouse. So this is probably more commercialized growing, permaculture maybe on a commercial scale. And they have pipes just running into the compost pile. And that probably goes into the boxes we can see, and I assume that they would have, because we can see electric hooked up to it, they have valves. So the valve opens or closes depending on the temperature range within. So if it's too cold, they open the valve and they take heat in. And if it's too hot, they'll close the valve and the heat can't go in. Or animals again. So these are ducks that are living underneath a greenhouse, and as again, any cuttings I'm working in my greenhouse, I can feed them to the animals. Rabbits also very easily can live in these conditions. So the cage for the rabbit can be underneath the grow beds, for instance. So next, we need to think about also being able to start seedlings early. So it's still winter, but I know the spring is coming. I want to get my seedlings started 2 weeks before the spring so I can get them in the ground, right? First day of planting outside. So in this instance, sometimes it's very cold, so we can have trays that heat the growing mixture or a potting mix, right? So I have my little pot tray, I'm going to pot all my seeds, and I stick it onto a warmer. So these give steady temperatures, especially overnight. It allows us to start seedlings early. A lot of seedlings germination is tied to the soil temperature. So I try to start my seedlings, but it gets too cold and they don't like it. So if I can keep the soil warm, the seedlings will germinate better. Some simple, very easy ways to do that. A lot of people take Christmas lights. You know, the Christmas lights that are inside the tube now, the LED lights. So if I get a string of LED Christmas lights and I put it inside sand, there's enough heat to warm the sand, which will keep my tray warm. So very simple. So other temperature ranges, ventilation, very important, especially if you have glass houses. You can open flaps. So it's important to provide fresh air supply and maintain even temperatures, okay? So roof ventilation should be typically described as 1/5 of your floor area. So whatever the size of my floor is, I can open 1/5 or 20% of the roof should be able to open, and that's more of a commercialized range. So you can look at ways to do that. As simple as just a hinge and a stick. If I push up the glass, it opens, things like that. So vents can be hinged, they could be louvered, they could allow air to come in, and they should be down at lower air. So we need to also imagine it's about a ventilation, right? So we need lower air vents and we need upper air vents so that we can create a draft so that the hot air can get out and the cool air can come in if we're overheating. And if it's too cool, then you close the vents, right?